The sovereign principality possessed an armada capable of glassing continents and plunging entire solar systems into eternal winter. For 6 millennia, their declarations of war had been met with weeping, desperate pleas for mercy and the immediate unconditional surrender of entire species. So when Grand Duke Alaric stood in the center of the diplomatic amphitheater and announced the imminent annihilation of the human race, he expected the human representative to fall to his knees. Instead, Ambassador Theodore Sterling simply adjusted his cuffs, glanced at his vintage Patek Philippe wristwatch, and leaned toward his microphone. A quick point of clarification. "Your Grace," Theodore said, his voice echoing through the dead silent hall. "Does this war start right now or after lunch? Because they're serving a rather exceptional beef Wellington at noon, and I'd hate to let it get cold." The Geneva Orbital Station was a marvel of human engineering, a massive spinning wheel of titanium-reinforced glass and hydroponic gardens suspended in the cold void between Earth and the Moon. It was officially classified as neutral ground, a place where the newly interstellar human race could negotiate with the vast ancient empires that populated the Orion Arm. Unofficially, it was the ultimate stage for humanity's favorite pastime, high-stakes political theater. In Suite 404, a secure lead-lined room practically vibrating with white noise generators and counter-espionage scramblers, Ambassador Theodore Sterling sat at the head of a long mahogany table. He did not look like a man whose species was staring down the barrel of extinction. He looked like a senior partner at a white shoe law firm facing a mildly annoying merger dispute. He was 55, his hair a distinguished salt and pepper, his bespoke charcoal suit immaculately tailored. Beside him stood Eleanor Harding, his chief of staff. Eleanor was a razor-sharp political operative who had cut her teeth navigating the vicious corporate wars of the late 21st century. She held a glowing datapad, her eyes scanning the scrolling text. "The sovereign delegation has locked down the main concourse," Eleanor reported, her tone strictly business. "Grand Duke Alaric has brought his full retinue. 30 Praetorian guards, 12 scribes, and a psychological operations team, masquerading as cultural attachés. They are projecting absolute confidence." Theodore took a sip of his black coffee. "Of course they are. They have 10,000 dreadnoughts and a recorded history of burning defiant planets to ash." "What's the word from Gallagher?" Eleanor tapped her screen, bringing up an encrypted communication channel. The holographic projector in the center of the table flickered to life, rendering the austere face of Richard Gallagher, the CEO of General Dynamics Exo Division. Behind Gallagher, the faint glow of orbital foundries suggested he was broadcasting directly from the shipyards over Mars. Ambassador Gallagher said, his voice clipped and efficient. "We are tracking the sovereign fleet movements. As predicted, they've massed their primary battle groups near the Alpha Centauri jump gate. They think they're hiding in the sensor shadows of the gas giant, but our deep space telemetry arrays picked up their thermal bloom 3 days ago. Are the assets in place?" Richard Theodore asked, leaning forward slightly. Gallagher offered a rare, thin smile. "Assets are green, Theodore. BlackRock Orbital and J.P. Morgan Stellar finalized the funding for the contingency last night. The market algorithms have already factored in a brief interstellar conflict. In fact, if the sovereign principality declares war today, their currency, the imperial credit, will collapse by 40% by tomorrow morning. Our short-selling positions are locked. We are about to make a killing, literally and financially. This was the terrifying secret of humanity. When Earth burst onto the galactic stage, they found a galaxy ruled by ancient monarchies, feudal empires, and religious hegemonies. These aliens waged war for honor, territory, and blood. Humanity, however, had long ago outsourced its most brutal instincts to the military-industrial complex and the stock market. Humanity didn't just fight wars, they leveraged them, budgeted them, and monetized them. What about the stealth mines? Eleanor interjected, her eyes fixed on the hologram. General Dynamics has deployed 80,000 autonomous thermonuclear micromines along their projected jump routes, Gallagher confirmed. They are powered down cold and dark, drifting like cosmic dust. The second we transmit the activation signal, the Sovereign fleet will find themselves flying into a localized supernova. But we need them to officially declare war first. The United Earth Directorate wants this by the book. We need the legal high ground to seize their mining colonies in the Sirius sector as reparations. You'll get your declaration, Richard Theodore said, checking his watch. It was 9:45 a.m. Alaric is too proud. He views us as upstart primates who need to be put in our place. He has no idea that he's not walking into a diplomatic summit. He's walking into an acquisition. Just remember the timing, Theodore Gallagher warned. The activation signal is tied to the orbital alignment of their flagship. You need to keep them in the chamber completely distracted until exactly 1300 hours standard time. If they break early and initiate a fleet jump before the mines are primed, we lose our window. I'll keep them occupied, Theodore promised. The hologram vanished, plunging the room back into the warm artificial light of the orbital station. Eleanor sighed, dropping the datapad onto the mahogany table. You realize, Eleanor said quietly, that if the timing is off by even 5 minutes, their dreadnoughts will materialize in Earth orbit and turn North America into a sheet of radioactive glass. I am aware of the stakes, Eleanor Theodore replied, standing up and buttoning his suit jacket. But you have to understand the psychology of the sovereign principality. They are theatrical. They love grand gestures. Alaric isn't just going to declare war, he's going to perform it. He'll want to savor our fear. We just have to deny him that satisfaction. Theodore walked toward the heavy steel doors of the suite. He paused and looked back at his aide. Besides, the diplomatic corps cafeteria really is serving beef Wellington today. I requested it specifically. Shall we? The Grand Assembly Hall of the Geneva Orbital was designed to intimidate. A massive domed amphitheater with tiered seating that could accommodate representatives from over 100 different alien species. At the center was the speaker's floor, a circular platform inlaid with the crest of the United Earth Directorate. When Theodore and Eleanor entered the hall, the atmosphere was thick with tension. The air was filled with the low murmurs, clicks, and chittering of dozens of neutral alien delegations. Everyone knew what was about to happen. The Sovereign Principality had issued a final grievance notice to Earth 72 hours prior. In galactic politics, a final grievance was a polite formality before orbital bombardment. On the far side of the hall, the sovereign delegation had already taken their places. Grand Duke Alaric was a towering figure, a bipedal reptilian humanoid clad in an ostentatious suit of ceremonial armor made of beaten gold and deep purple silks. His scaled face was set in a permanent sneer, his slit pupil eyes radiating an ancient inherited arrogance. Flanking him were 24 massive Praetorian guards, their plasma rifles resting entirely too casually in their heavily clawed hands. Theodore walked calmly to the human desk opposite Alaric. He sat down, pulled a sleek silver fountain pen from his breast pocket, and began to arrange his blank sheets of paper with agonizing precision. He ignored the Grand Duke entirely. The slight did not go unnoticed. Alaric's scales flushed a deep, angry crimson. The Grand Duke stepped up to the central podium, the hover cameras of a dozen galactic news networks swarming around him like mechanical flies. Representatives of the Galactic Concord Alaric began, his voice amplified by the room's acoustics, carrying the booming resonant bass of a predator. For 2 decades, the sovereign principality has tolerated the presence of the human species on the fringes of our borders. We allowed you to mine the dead rocks of your pathetic system. We allowed you to traverse the hyperlanes, provided you paid the appropriate tithes. We offered you the protection of our shadow. Alaric paused, glaring down at Theodore, who was currently examining the nib of his fountain pen with intense interest. But humanity has proven itself to be a parasitic and ungrateful race. Alaric roared, slamming a gauntleted fist onto the podium. The sound echoed like a gunshot. Several minor ambassadors in the upper tiers flinched. You have violated our trade embargoes. Your corporate entities, these Boeing and Lockheed syndicates, have been caught selling advanced propulsion technologies to our vassal states, sowing rebellion and chaos. Eleanor leaned over to Theodore. He's not wrong, she whispered. Lockheed made an absolute fortune arming the Orion rebels last quarter. Free market enterprise, Eleanor. Theodore whispered back, not taking his eyes off his paper. We can't control where the goods end up after the point of sale. Your insolence ends today, Alaric proclaimed, raising his arms. A massive holographic projection flared to life above the center of the room. It displayed the Sol system. Red icons representing the massive sovereign dreadnoughts began to encircle Earth in a terrifying, suffocating net. This is a live tactical feed of the Alpha Centauri jump gate. Alaric sneered, his voice dripping with malice. 10,000 ships of the line. Enough firepower to boil your oceans and shatter your continents. Our targeting computers have already locked onto your major population centers. Washington, London, Beijing, Geneva. In mere moments, the command will be given, and your world will be scoured of life. The entire assembly hall held its breath. The silence was absolute, a heavy, suffocating blanket of impending doom. The representatives of the galaxy watched the human ambassador, expecting him to break to weep, to offer the immediate and unconditional surrender of his species. Alaric pointed a single clawed finger at Theodore. I am authorized by the Emperor himself to offer you one final mercy. Order your defense fleets to power down. Hand over the executives of your offending corporations to face imperial justice. Sign over the mining rights of the Sol system to the Principality in perpetuity. Kneel, Ambassador Theodore. Kneel and beg for the lives of your children, or face total war. The Grand Duke finished his speech, his chest heaving, his eyes burning with triumphant fire. He had delivered the perfect ultimatum. He waited for the inevitable collapse of the human spirit. At his desk, Theodore finished writing a note on his paper. He carefully capped his fountain pen and placed it back in his pocket. He looked up at the towering alien warlord. Total war, Theodore repeated softly, his voice carrying effortlessly through the microphone. He rubbed his chin, looking genuinely thoughtful. Well, that does sound rather severe. Theodore stood up, buttoning his suit jacket. He looked around the silent, terrified assembly and then met Alaric's burning gaze. He checked his Patek Philippe watch. It was 11:45 a.m. He needed to stall for 1 hour and 15 minutes. A quick point of clarification. Your Grace. Theodore said, his voice polite, conversational, utterly devoid of fear. Does this war start right now or after lunch? Because they're serving a rather exceptional beef Wellington at noon, and I'd hate to let it get cold. For a moment, The universal translators in the earpieces of the alien delegates seemed to malfunction. There was a collective murmur of confusion. A high-ranking diplomat from the avian Corvus system tapped his earpiece, frantically convinced the machine had mistranslated the human's response. Grand Duke Alaric froze. The triumphant fire in his eyes was instantly replaced by a profound, paralyzing bewilderment. He opened his jaw, closed it, and then opened it again. Lunch. Alaric rasped the word, tasting foul in his mouth. I just informed you that your species is seconds away from absolute extermination, and you are asking about lunch. Well, yes, Theodore replied, smoothly, stepping out from behind his desk and walking toward the center of the floor, hands clasped behind his back. You see, diplomacy is taxing work, Alaric, and the Geneva Orbital catering staff has flown in prime Angus beef specifically for today's summit. Pastry crust mushroom duxelles, a really exquisite red wine reduction. It takes hours to prepare properly. It would be a profound insult to the chef if we were all vaporized before the first course. Alaric's armor rattled as his body trembled with suppressed rage. He had prepared for tears. He had prepared for defiance. He had prepared for frantic negotiations. He had not prepared for culinary critique. You mock me, Alaric snarled, taking a threatening step forward. His Praetorian guards raised their plasma rifles, targeting lasers, painting angry red dots on Theodore's chest. I assure you, I am deadly serious, Theodore said, not even flinching at the lasers. He casually examined his fingernails. You have issued an ultimatum. Excellent. Very dramatic. The holograms were a nice touch, really. But there are protocols to these things. United Earth Directorate bureaucratic guidelines mandate a 72-hour review period for any formal declaration of interstellar war. I do not care about your pathetic bureaucracy. Alaric roared his voice, shaking the glass observation windows. My fleet is fueled. The slipspace drives are spinning up. With a single word, I can end your civilization. But you haven't said the word yet, have you? Theodore countered his voice, suddenly dropping its conversational tone, hardening into something cold and sharp. He stepped right up to the edge of the podium, craning his neck to look the towering alien in the eye. You're waiting, Theodore said softly. You're waiting because the Emperor wants to see me break on live galactic feed. You're waiting because your economy is heavily dependent on the resources you intend to extort from us today. If you just glass Earth, you get nothing but radioactive ash, and your imperial treasury cannot afford another expensive, protracted pacification campaign. Alaric's eyes widened a fraction of an inch. Theodore had hit a nerve. So Theodore continued stepping back and gesturing expansively to the room. We are at a stalemate. You want me to surrender so you don't have to spend the fuel and munitions. I am telling you that I will not surrender before I have had my lunch. Therefore, I propose a short recess. We reconvene here at 13:30 hours. At that time, you can officially declare your war, and we can proceed with the violence. The audacity was staggering. Up in the viewing gallery, the Galactic news reporters were whispering frantically into their microphones, broadcasting the bizarre standoff to trillions of viewers across the Orion Arm. Alaric stared at Theodore, trying to read the human's face. Was this madness? Was it a desperate bluff? Or was there something else entirely going on? You think this is a game? Alaric hissed, leaning down. You think you can buy time for your pathetic defense fleets to assemble? My dreadnoughts will crush them in seconds. I'm not buying time for a fleet, Alaric. Theodore smiled, a chilling corporate smile that didn't reach his eyes. I just really like beef Wellington. Alaric sneered, standing back up to his full height. He looked at the human with absolute contempt. Very well. If the condemned wishes for a final meal, the principality is generous enough to grant it. 1 hour, ambassador. Enjoy your meat and pastry, because at 1300 hours standard time, the soul system will burn. Excellent, Theodore nodded briskly. I'll see you at 1330. I said 1300 hours, Alaric snapped. I eat slowly, Theodore replied, without missing a beat, turning his back on the most dangerous warlord in the sector and walking back to his desk. Eleanor was waiting for him, her face a mask of professional calm, though her hands gripped her datapad so tightly her knuckles were white. Theodore leaned in close. Time, he whispered. 11:55, Eleanor whispered back. You just bought us exactly 65 minutes. Gallagher's team is running the final diagnostic on the stealth mines. Let's go to the dining room, Theodore said aloud, making a show of straightening his tie. I'm famished. The human delegation filed out of the assembly hall, leaving the rest of the galaxy in stunned silence. As soon as the heavy steel doors of the diplomatic wing closed behind them, Theodore's casual demeanor vanished. The corridor was secured by heavily armed United Earth Marines, their faces hidden behind dark visors. Status on the Sovereign Communications Network. Theodore asked, marching rapidly down the hall toward the secure command center, masquerading as a VIP dining suite. Our intelligence operatives tapped their localized subspace relays 10 minutes ago, Eleanor reported, matching his brisk pace. Alaric just sent a priority 0 transmission to his flagship at Alpha Centauri. He ordered them to hold position and keep the slipspace drives at maximum standby. He wants them ready to jump the exact second he gives the order at 1300. Perfect. Theodore breathed a predator's gleam in his eye. They are sitting exactly where we want them. Engines' hot shields lowered for the jump sequence, completely blind to their immediate surroundings due to the radiation glare of the gas giant. They entered the secure suite. Instead of a dining table, the room was dominated by a massive tactical holo table displaying the Alpha Centauri system. Standing around the table were several high-ranking generals of the United Earth Space Command, including General Harrison, a scarred veteran of the early asteroid skirmishes. Ambassador General Harrison grunted, saluting lazily. That was quite a show out there. After lunch, seriously, it was the only excuse I could think of that was insulting enough to distract him from running a proper sensor sweep of his staging area, Theodore said, taking his place at the head of the table. Is the trap set, General? General Dynamics just sent the green light, Harrison said, pointing to a cluster of invisible dots surrounding the massive red icons of the alien fleet. 80,000 stealth mines. The Sovereign fleet is currently sitting in the middle of the densest explosive field ever engineered by human hands. Because their drives are spooled up, the background, radiation is masking the thermal signatures of the mines. What about our fleet? Theodore asked. The 3rd, 4th, and 7th carrier strike groups are holding in the Oort cloud, Harrison replied. They are fully powered, synced to the master clock. As soon as the mines detonate, they jump directly into the Sovereign Principality's core worlds. We bypass their front line entirely. While they burn here, we seize their capital. Theodore looked at the countdown clock projected on the wall. It read 12:15. 45 minutes until the deadline. 45 minutes until humanity crossed the Rubicon and fundamentally changed the balance of power in the galaxy forever. Are we absolutely certain about the legalities? Eleanor Theodore asked, looking back at his aide. It was a bizarre question, given that they were about to wipe out an armada of 10,000 ships, but this was the human way. Every atrocity had to be properly filed. Under Section 4, Paragraph B of the Galactic Concordat, a preemptive strike is legally classified as self-defense if a hostile power has publicly declared intent to destroy a sovereign world and has maneuvered strategic assets to execute that threat, Eleanor recited flawlessly. Alaric's little holographic presentation in the assembly hall, coupled with his verbal threat to scour Earth of life, constitutes a formal and legally binding declaration of hostile intent. We are perfectly within our rights to defend ourselves with extreme prejudice. And the financial aspect? Theodore asked. Eleanor smiled, a sharp, dangerous expression. Wall Street is moving. BlackRock Orbital just finalized the acquisition of sovereign debt belonging to the Principality's vassal states. Once the core fleet is destroyed, those vassal states will rebel. They will need weapon supplies and infrastructure. We will sell it to them at a premium financed by loans from J.P. Morgan Stellar. We aren't just going to defeat the sovereign principality, Theodore. We are going to bankrupt them, buy their assets for pennies on the dollar, and make them pay us for the privilege. Theodore nodded slowly. He looked back at the holographic projection of the doomed alien fleet. He felt no pity. The sovereign principality had murdered billions over the centuries. They had built an empire on slavery and terror. They thought they were the apex predators of the universe. But they had made a fatal miscalculation. They had brought a dreadnought to a corporate hostile takeover. "Get Gallagher on the line," Theodore commanded softly. "Tell him to synchronize the detonators to exactly 12:59 and 50 seconds, 10 seconds before Alaric's deadline." "Why 12:59?" General Harrison asked, raising an eyebrow. "Why not let him make his little speech first?" Because Theodore said, a dark smile finally breaking across his face. "I don't want him to have the satisfaction of starting this war. And more importantly, I really am getting hungry." The countdown clock ticked away. In the Grand Assembly Hall, Grand Duke Alaric paced furiously, waiting for the hour to pass, oblivious to the fact that his empire was not about to be conquered by warriors, but liquidated by accountants. The trap was sprung. The clock was ticking. And humanity was about to have a very bloody, very profitable lunch. At 12:50 p.m., the heavy blast-resistant doors of the Grand Assembly Hall hissed open. The collective gaze of 100 terrified extraterrestrial species snapped toward the entrance. Ambassador Theodore Sterling strolled back into the amphitheater. He was not accompanied by heavily armored Marines or frantic military aides. Instead, he was followed by a nervous-looking human intern named Thomas, who was pushing a silver-plated service cart. Upon the cart rested a pristine white porcelain plate, a crystal glass, a bottle of 2082 Chateau Margaux, and a perfectly crusted slab of beef Wellington, resting in a pool of dark, rich demi-glace. Theodore took his seat at the human desk, tucked a linen napkin into his collar, and picked up his silverware. Thomas hastily poured the wine and scurried away. Grand Duke Alaric stared from the central podium, his reptilian brain struggling to process the sheer, unadulterated disrespect unfolding before him. The holographic map above the room still glowed with the menacing red icons of the sovereign fleet at Alpha Centauri, a sword of Damocles hovering over Earth. Yet the human ambassador was inspecting the flakiness of his pastry crust. "I must admit," Theodore said, speaking into his microphone between bites, his voice echoing through the silent, cavernous hall. The catering staff outdid themselves. The mushroom duxelles is superb. You should have joined me, Alaric. I imagine the rations on those dreadnoughts of yours leave much to be desired. You are a madman, Alaric rumbled. His scales had turned a mottled bruised purple, an indicator of adrenaline flooding his system. You sit there gorging yourself while the annihilation of your species ticks down to mere minutes. Is this the famed human stoicism, or simply the delusion of a prey animal that has lost its mind? Theodore took a slow, deliberate sip of his wine. He checked his Patek Philippe watch. 12:56. I am neither mad nor deluded, Your Grace, Theodore replied, dabbing the corners of his mouth. I am simply a man who appreciates efficiency. You see, while you've been standing there rehearsing your victory speech, my team has been conducting an audit of your empire's infrastructure. Do you have any idea how grossly over-leveraged the sovereign principality is? Alaric blinked, thrown entirely off balance. What gibberish are you speaking? Eleanor Harding stepped out from the shadows of the delegation wing, her datapad glowing. She didn't sit. She stood beside Theodore, projecting a new secondary hologram next to Alaric's tactical map. It wasn't a map of stars. It was a sprawling line graph, currently holding steady, but showing immense volume. Goldman Sachs Stellar and Vanguard Interstellar just executed a coordinated dump of 10 trillion imperial credits. Eleanor announced to the room, her voice devoid of emotion. Simultaneously, State Street Global Advisors have placed unprecedented short positions on your heavy munitions manufacturing sector. We've also bought up the sovereign debt of your 3 largest agricultural vassal worlds. The alien delegates in the tiered seating began to murmur. They didn't understand the intricacies of human high-frequency trading, but the words debt and dump translated perfectly across all dialects. You speak of credits and debt, while my cannons are aimed at your home world. Alaric roared, slamming his fist against the podium so hard the metal buckled. You pathetic apes, at 1300 hours your banks will be vapor, your stock markets will be ash, and your credits will mean absolutely nothing. That's the beauty of decentralized orbital servers, Alaric. Theodore smiled. Our financial institutions don't reside on Earth anymore. They exist in the cloud, and they are legally bound to outlive us, but we won't need them to. The clock hit 12:58. Tell me, Grand Duke. Theodore asked, his tone suddenly dropping its theatrical lightness. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the mahogany desk. When you ordered your fleet to hold at Alpha Centauri and spool their slipspace drives for a synchronized jump, did you run a wide-spectrum thermal sweep of the surrounding debris field? Alaric's eyes narrowed. The radiation glare of the gas giant makes standard sweeping impossible. It matters not. We are in deep space. There is nothing there but rocks and dust. And 80,000 autonomous thermonuclear micromines manufactured by Raytheon Exo Defense. Theodore corrected him gently. The silence in the room became absolute. It was a physical weight pressing down on everyone present. Alaric froze. What? The Grand Duke whispered the universal translator, struggling to convey the sudden, terrifying drop in his vocal register. Theodore checked his watch. 12:59 and 40 seconds. I told you, Theodore said, picking up his wine glass. I don't like my lunch getting cold, and I abhor being rushed. 12:59 and 45 seconds. Communications, Alaric bellowed, turning toward his scribe's absolute panic, finally shattering his arrogant facade. Transmit the abort signal, Power down the drives. Power down the drives now. 12:59 and 50 seconds. Theodore raised his glass toward the Grand Duke. Checkmate, Theodore whispered. 4 light-years away, in the shadow of a massive roiling gas giant, the sovereign principality's armada floated in perfect, terrifying formation. 10,000 ships of the line. Kilometer-long dreadnoughts bristling with plasma batteries, troop transports carrying millions of genetically engineered shock infantry, and the flagship Imperious, a floating citadel of black iron and gold. Inside, the Imperious alarms suddenly screamed. Tactical officers scrambled across the bridge as their sensors, previously blinded by the gas giant's radiation, suddenly registered 80,000 localized thermal spikes blooming all around them. The stealth mines powered by microscopic dark matter batteries had slept cold and silent for weeks. Now, receiving the encrypted pulse from General Dynamics, they woke up. There was no time to maneuver. There was no time to raise deflector shields, which had been intentionally lowered to allow the slipspace drives to anchor onto the dimensional fabric. The detonation was not a fiery explosion. There is no fire in a vacuum. It was a synchronized, blinding flash of pure, unleashed atomic fury. 80,000 thermonuclear detonations triggered simultaneously. In a standard combat scenario, dreadnought armor could withstand nuclear yields. But humanity had not relied on the explosive force alone. They had relied on physics. The mines were positioned precisely at the weak points of the fleet's slipspace field generators. When the nukes hit, the concussive energy and EMP shockwaves ripped through the unshielded drives. A slipspace drive operates by containing a miniature artificial singularity. When those containments shattered, the physics of the universe asserted themselves violently. 10,000 artificial singularities collapsed at once. The resulting implosion ripped a hole in the fabric of space-time. The massive sovereign dreadnoughts were not destroyed. They were unraveled. Ships were stretched into kilometers-long strings of superheated atoms, screaming silently into the void as they were sucked into microscopic black holes that evaporated a fraction of a second later in blinding flashes of gamma radiation. In the span of 4 seconds, the greatest armada the Orion Arm had ever seen was reduced to a swirling cloud of ionized dust and subatomic debris. Back in the Geneva Orbital Grand Assembly Hall, the massive holographic tactical map flickered. The 10,000 menacing red icons that had encircled the Sol system blinked rapidly. Then, in a wave of cascading static, they turned gray. Then they vanished entirely. The display showed nothing but empty space. Lost contact. A sovereign communications officer stammered, his claws flying over his terminal. Your Grace, telemetry is gone. The carrier waves are gone. I have nothing. Alaric stood at the podium, rigid as a statue. He stared at the empty space where his invincible fleet had been just seconds before. Bring them back online, he commanded, his voice hollow. Reboot the relay. Your Grace, the officer wept, collapsing to his knees. There is no relay. The local subspace buoys are registering a gamma burst equivalent to a localized supernova. The fleet is gone. Pandemonium erupted. The delegates from 100 worlds leaped to their feet, screaming, chittering, and squawking in shock. A fleet that had subjugated a third of the galaxy for 6,000 years had just been deleted in the time it took a human to swallow a sip of wine. Eleanor, Theodore said softly, cutting through the noise in his immediate vicinity. Already on it, Eleanor replied, her fingers flying across her datapad. She switched the central holographic projector from the tactical map to the Galactic exchange ticker. The visual was devastating. The imperial credit, the reserve currency of the sovereign principality, was in freefall. The line graph plummeted straight down a terrifying red streak. The market algorithms detected the destruction of their military assets via subspace flash trading networks. Eleanor narrated, speaking clearly into the microphone so the entire hall could hear. Without a military to enforce their colonial tithes, the principality's credit rating has just been downgraded to junk status. Margin calls are triggering across every banking sector in the Orion Arm. Alaric slowly turned his head to look at Theodore. The Grand Duke looked as though he had aged 1,000 years in a single minute. The arrogance was gone, replaced by a profound existential terror. "You," Alaric choked out, "you murdered millions of my people. You destroyed my fleet. I engaged in aggressive corporate defense." Theodore corrected him smoothly, setting down his napkin. "You threatened our assets. We liquidated yours. And now, Grand Duke, we are going to discuss the terms of your restructuring." The doors to the assembly hall blew open, but this time it was not an intern with a lunch cart. 4 United Earth Directorate Marines poured into the room, their magnetic boots clanking heavily on the floor. They wore heavy power armor, their faces obscured by black visors, carrying compact rail rifles that hummed with lethal potential. They immediately formed a perimeter around the human desk, though their weapons remained casually pointed at the floor. It was a display of absolute control. General Harrison walked in behind them, a datapad tucked under his arm. He marched straight up to Theodore and offered a crisp salute. "Ambassador, Operation Bear Market was a total success. General Dynamics confirms a 99.8% asset destruction rate at Alpha Centauri. Our carrier groups have executed their slipspace jumps from the Oort cloud." Alaric flinched. "Your carrier groups jumping where?" Theodore tapped his desk. The holographic projector changed again. This time it displayed a live feed of Sovereign Prime, the glittering jewel of the Principality's empire, a planet covered entirely in gilded palaces and sprawling bureaucratic spires. Suddenly, the skies above Sovereign Prime began to warp. Massive slipspace ruptures tore open the atmosphere. Dozens of human supercarriers, angular and brutalist, constructed of dark gray steel and bristling with railgun batteries, materialized in low orbit. They blotted out the sun. "What is this?" Alaric screamed, spit flying from his fanged mouth. "You attack our capital. Our defensive platforms will rip you to shreds." "Actually, Your Grace," Eleanor said, consulting her screen. "Your defensive platforms are powered down. We bought the corporate contract for the grid's maintenance software last week through a shell company. We just pushed a localized software update that triggered a hard reboot. They'll be offline for the next 48 hours. Alaric stumbled backward, grabbing the podium to keep from collapsing. He was entirely beaten. His military was space dust. His economy was bankrupt. His homeworld was occupied. And the architect of his destruction was sitting 30 feet away, calmly finishing a piece of beef. Theodore stood up. He buttoned his suit jacket, took the datapad from General Harrison, and walked out from behind his desk. The room was deathly quiet as he approached the central podium where the broken alien warlord stood. Theodore slid the datapad across the podium to Alaric. "This is not a treaty, Grand Duke." Theodore said, his voice cold, devoid of the earlier mockery. It was the voice of a man who owned the room, the station, and now a sizable chunk of the galaxy. "We do not do treaties with entities that threaten our children. This is a binding contract of acquisition." Alaric looked down at the glowing screen. He couldn't read English, but his cybernetic translator fed the brutal legalese directly into his brain. Article 1. Theodore recited from memory. The sovereign principality officially dissolves its military command structure. All remaining defensive assets are hereby integrated into the United Earth Space Command. Alaric shook his head in disbelief. You demand our submission. I demand your collateral, Theodore corrected. Article 2. As reparations for the emotional distress and logistical inconvenience caused by your little blockade, the sovereign principality agrees to cede all mining rights, hyperlane toll authorities, and orbital foundries to a joint conglomerate managed by United Earth Directorate. This is slavery, Alaric hissed. We are a proud people. The Emperor will never agree to this. He will order our populations to fight you in the streets. The Emperor won't do anything of the sort, Theodore replied, his eyes narrowing. Because as of 2 minutes ago, the Emperor's personal royal treasury, which was heavily invested in the munitions sector, has been wiped out. He is completely destitute. However, if he signs this document, the United Earth Directorate is prepared to offer him a very generous severance package. A comfortable retirement on a Class M resort moon, complete with a modest stipend. Provided, of course, he signs a non-compete clause. Theodore leaned in closer to the Grand Duke. Your empire is dead, Alaric. Not because we shot it, but because we bought it. We leveraged your arrogance, shorted your currency, and foreclosed on your military. You can either sign the document and accept the buyout, or we will initiate aggressive liquidation. And I promise you General Harrison's Marines are far less polite than my accountants. The assembly hall remained in stunned silence. The representatives of 100 worlds watched as the galaxy's most terrifying conqueror was reduced to a bankrupt middle manager facing termination. Alaric looked at the human ambassador. He saw no honor. He saw no martial glory. He saw only the cold, unyielding machinery of human commerce and strategy, a force far more destructive than any plasma battery. With a trembling, clawed hand, Grand Duke Alaric pressed his biometric signature to the human datapad. Excellent, Theodore said briskly, taking the datapad back. He turned to the bewildered alien delegates in the gallery. Ladies, gentlemen, and esteemed entities, the sovereign principality is now under new management. Earth looks forward to establishing highly profitable trade relations with all of your respective systems. Have a wonderful afternoon. Theodore turned back toward his desk. He picked up his crystal glass, finished the last of his wine, and looked at Thomas the intern. Thomas, clear the plates, please, Theodore said, adjusting his cuffs. I have a board meeting at 1400, and we have an entire empire to inventory. The royal palace on Sovereign Prime was a monument to 6 millennia of uninterrupted conquest. Its spires were carved from the bones of extinct leviathans, and its grand halls were lined with the banners of 1,000 subjugated worlds. For centuries, the throne room had been the center of the universe, a place where alien kings and planetary governors crawled on their bellies to beg for the Emperor's mercy. On the Tuesday following the Alpha Centauri liquidation, the throne room was occupied by 45 accountants from Deloitte Interstellar and KPMG Galactic. Emperor Malachor, a terrifying reptilian behemoth whose scales were encrusted with ceremonial diamonds, sat rigidly upon the obsidian throne. His royal guard had been disarmed, replaced by heavily augmented private security contractors from Academia Interstellar, who stood in silent overwatch with rail carbines resting against their armored chests. The Emperor's court, usually filled with sycophants and warlords, was now crowded with human junior analysts setting up holographic spreadsheets over the ancient marble floors. Graham Pierce, a senior partner and forensic auditor for Deloitte, walked up the steps of the dais. He did not bow. He did not avert his eyes. He carried a tablet computer and wore a perfectly tailored navy blue suit that looked entirely out of place against the Gothic barbarism of the palace. "Emperor Malachor," Graham said, swiping a finger across his screen. "I am going to need the decryption keys for the Royal Treasury's offshore dark matter accounts. We've found a discrepancy in the quarterly tithes from the Sirius sector, and Palantir's predictive algorithms suggest you've been funneling planetary defense budgets into a private slush fund." Malachor's eyes burned with a hatred so profound it seemed to lower the temperature in the room. "You dare speak to the Lord of the Stars in this manner? Your ambassador signed a buyout. He did not claim my soul." "Actually, sir, under Section 12, Clause 4 of the Acquisition Treaty, all sovereign and personal assets of the royal family are subject to a comprehensive audit to ensure adequate collateralization of your newly assumed debt." Graham corrected his voice entirely devoid of inflection. "And we are finding a massive amount of unrecorded liabilities." Malachor leaned forward, his massive claws gripping the armrests of the obsidian throne. "You humans think you have won because you destroyed one fleet. You think your banks and your ledgers can chain a god. I am the Emperor. I have ruled this sector since your species was banging rocks together in the mud." "Be that as it may," Graham sighed, clearly annoyed by the dramatic outburst. "Your credit score is currently hovering in the subprime range, and we really need to finalize this inventory." "Inventory this," Malachor hissed. The Emperor reached beneath the hidden console of his throne and slammed a palm onto a biometric scanner. A heavy mechanical grinding echoed beneath the palace floor. Deep within the crust of Sovereign Prime, ancient tectonic vault doors began to slide open. Malachor smiled, a terrifying display of razor-sharp teeth. "Did you truly believe Grand Duke Alaric commanded the entirety of our strength? At the core of this planet lies the Omega Contingency, a fleet of autonomous planet-cracking dreadnoughts powered by singularity engines. They have no crews. They have no slipspace signatures to detect. They are slaved directly to my biometric pulse. I have just awakened them. In 3 minutes, they will breach the crust launch into orbit and reduce your corporate blockade to ash. Then they will jump to Earth." The alien courtiers in the room gasped hope, suddenly reigniting in their eyes. The Emperor had outsmarted the humans. The ancient power of the principality was not dead. Graham Pierce did not flinch. He didn't even look up from his tablet. He simply tapped his earpiece. "Samantha, the client just triggered the Omega Vault. High above the planet, aboard a Halliburton orbital command carrier, Samantha Reed, the ruthless executive director of planetary restructuring, leaned over a tactical display. "Confirmed, Graham. We're tracking the seismic activity. Vault doors are open." "Can we proceed with the repossession?" Graham asked. "Executing now," Samantha replied. Down in the throne room, the deep mechanical rumbling suddenly stopped. The planet stopped shaking. The terrifying hum of singularity engines powering up abruptly died out, replaced by absolute deafening silence. Malachor frowned, slamming his hand against the biometric scanner again and again. "Launch, I command you to launch." "It's not going to work, Malachor," Graham said, stepping closer to the throne. "You see, when we audited your central banking infrastructure, we discovered that you used the Omega Contingency Fleet as collateral for a massive high-risk loan 3 decades ago to finance your war against the avian hegemony." a loan structured through a shadow bank in the neutral zone. Malachor froze, his blood running cold. How could you possibly know about the Iron Bank of Kale? Because Citadel Securities bought the Iron Bank of Kale last Thursday. Graham stated, a faint predatory smile finally touching his lips. We own the debt, and since you just formally defaulted on your empire by signing Theodore's treaty, the bank foreclosed on the collateral. Palantir's cyber warfare division uploaded a proprietary ransomware worm into the Omega Fleet's mainframe about 20 minutes ago. Those planet crackers belong to United Earth now. In fact, General Dynamics is already negotiating a contract to strip them down for scrap metal. The Emperor stared at the human accountant, the sheer scale of the violation breaking something deep within his ancient imperial mind. The humans hadn't just defeated his military, they had weaponized his own economy against him. You are demons, Malachor whispered, slumping back into the obsidian throne. We are fiduciaries, Emperor, Graham corrected, tapping his screen one last time. Now, about those decryption keys. If you refuse to hand them over, I am legally authorized to have academic contractors repossess the diamonds off your scales to cover the interest on the missed payments. Shall we proceed? While the central government of the sovereign principality was dismantled by corporate lawyers, the fringes of the empire refused to go quietly into the night. Deep in the radioactive shroud of the Tartarus Nebula, an astropolitical anomaly that scrambled standard sensor arrays, High Admiral Kalen had spent the last 2 months gathering the remnants of the Imperial Armada. Kalen was a zealot, a military purist who viewed the Emperor's surrender as the ultimate heresy. He had rallied 300 surviving cruisers, 50 heavy destroyers, and a massive orbital shipyard that had been towed into the nebula to escape the human audit. This was the Resistance. It was a fleet fueled by vengeance, heavily armed and totally invisible to human tracking networks. Or so Kalen believed. Aboard his flagship, the Vengeance Kalen paced the bridge. Status of the localized jump drives, he barked. Spun to maximum, High Admiral, his navigation officer replied. We have enough dark matter fuel for one massive synchronized jump. We can bypass the human orbital blockades entirely and materialize directly in the upper atmosphere of Earth. They will burn before they can even access their pathetic stock markets. Kalen nodded, a grim satisfaction settling over him. Open a Priority 0 subspace channel, unencrypted. Direct it to the United Earth Directorate headquarters on the Geneva orbital. Let the human ambassador look upon his doom before it arrives. The bridge screens flickered, tearing through the static of the nebula until the image stabilized. Ambassador Theodore Sterling appeared on the massive main viewer. He was not in a war room. He was standing on a lush, meticulously manicured green lawn, wearing a white polo shirt and a visor. He was holding a golf club, and the backdrop revealed he was in one of the Geneva Orbital's luxury biodome country clubs. Hello, Theodore asked, squinting slightly. Who is this? The connection is terrible. Thomas, tell the IT department that the subspace router in the clubhouse is acting up again. I am High Admiral Kalen, the last true sword of the sovereign principality. Kalen roared, insulted by the casual domesticity of his sworn enemy. I speak to you from the shadows, human. You thought you conquered us with your paper treaties and your cowards' ledgers. But the true fire of the Empire still burns. Theodore rested his golf club on his shoulder, his expression instantly sobering. Ah, Kalen. Yes, Palantir flagged you as a high-risk flight asset. I was wondering when you were going to call. How is the weather in the Tartarus Nebula. Kalen recoiled as if struck. How do you know my location? This nebula shields all thermal and tachyon emissions. It shields emissions, yes. Theodore nodded casually, tossing a golf ball in his hand. But it doesn't shield invoice receipts. Kalen stared at the screen, utterly baffled. What? Admiral running a rogue fleet of 350 warships requires a colossal amount of logistical support, Theodore explained, adopting the tone of a disappointed professor. You need dark matter fuel hypercoolant and raw plasma cells. Where do you think your quartermasters have been buying those supplies over the last 2 months? From the black market smugglers of the Outer Rim? Kalen snapped. Untraceable syndicates that despise your corporate tyranny. Theodore chuckled softly. Oh, Kalen, the black market hasn't been independent since we arrived. We acquired the primary smuggling syndicates through a hostile proxy takeover 3 weeks ago. It was a brilliant move by the team at Berkshire Hathaway Interstellar. You haven't been buying from rogue smugglers. You've been buying directly from ExxonMobil Exo Logistics. Panic began to creep up Kalen's spine. He looked at his navigation officer, whose hands were suddenly flying across the control panels in a desperate frenzy. High Admiral, the officer shouted, his voice cracking with terror. The fuel reserves, the dark matter manifolds are locking down. The hypercoolant valves are sealing shut. On the screen, Theodore leaned closer to the camera. Did you really think we would sell you weapons-grade fuel without installing a backdoor DRM code? You violated the terms of service agreement, Kalen. Using ExxonMobil fuel for unauthorized acts of interstellar terrorism is strictly prohibited under our end-user license agreement. Override the system, Kalen screamed at his crew, drawing his plasma pistol. Manually bypass the valves. We can't, the officer wept. The ship's entire operating system just updated. It's demanding a biometric authentication from a registered United Earth corporate officer. It's called a dead switch, Kalen, Theodore said coldly. And unfortunately, since your fleet is currently stranded in a highly radioactive nebula without functional coolant systems, your plasma cores are going to reach critical mass in exactly 4 minutes. Kalen dropped his pistol, the reality of his situation crushing the last remnants of his imperial pride. They hadn't fought a battle. They hadn't even fired a shot. They had simply been out-contracted. However, Theodore continued checking his Patek Philippe watch. As a gesture of goodwill, the United Earth Directorate is willing to offer you an emergency bailout. We will transmit the DRM unlock codes and vent your cores if you agree to unconditionally surrender the entire fleet to the salvage subsidiary of General Dynamics. You will be stripped of your rank. Your men will become indentured contractors for our asteroid mining operations, and your ships will be melted down to build our new freighters. You ask me to sell my honor? Kalen whispered, staring at the polished white shoes of the human ambassador on the screen. I'm not asking you to sell it, Theodore corrected. I'm telling you that it has already been liquidated. You have 3 minutes, Admiral. Make a choice. Burn in the dark or clock in for your shift. The High Admiral looked out the viewport at his magnificent crippled armada. He looked at the terrified faces of his bridge crew. The Empire was truly dead. There were no warriors left in the galaxy, only employees. We surrender, Kalen choked out. Excellent, Theodore smiled warmly, returning to his cheerful country club demeanor. I'll have Thomas fax over the employment contracts. Welcome to the company, Kalen. The screen went black. Theodore handed his club to his intern. Good work, Thomas. Set up the next tee. I think I'm finally fixing my slice. 6 months after the fall of the sovereign principality, the political landscape of the Orion Arm had been completely redrawn. The brutal feudal warlords who had once terrorized the stars were gone, replaced by a sprawling, ruthlessly efficient bureaucracy. The United Earth Directorate had achieved what no alien empire ever could: total galactic peace. They achieved it not through the threat of violence, but through the terrifying reality of absolute economic dependency. In the newly renovated Grand Assembly Hall of the Geneva Orbital Station, Ambassador Theodore Sterling stood before a packed audience. The delegates from 100 alien species were present, but they no longer wore ceremonial armor or carried energy weapons. They wore subdued diplomatic robes, and many of them clutched glowing data pads filled with stock tickers and quarterly projections. Behind Theodore, the massive holographic display did not show fleet movements or tactical battle lines. It displayed a massive glowing pie chart breaking down the gross domestic product of the entire galactic quadrant. Distinguished delegates, shareholders, and newly acquired subsidiaries. Theodore began, his voice smooth and commanding. I want to thank you all for attending the first annual general meeting of the United Earth Galactic Trade Coalition. A quiet, nervous murmur rippled through the amphitheater. The alien representatives watched Theodore with a mixture of awe and absolute terror. They knew the stories. They knew what happened to the sovereign principality. They knew about the hostile takeovers, the stealth mines, the foreclosed armadas. We have had a remarkably profitable fiscal year. Theodore continued, clicking a remote in his hand. The hologram shifted to show towering graphs of exponential growth. Through aggressive restructuring, we have stabilized the former sovereign territories. Our infrastructure partner, Halliburton Galactic, has rebuilt their ruined supply chains. Vanguard Interstellar has successfully integrated their agrarian worlds into a centralized, efficient commodities market. An avian ambassador from the Corvus system tentatively raised a feathered wing. Ambassador Sterling, if I may proceed, Ambassador Xylos. Theodore nodded gracefully. The Corvus Assembly wishes to know the status of our border dispute with the Orion separatists. Xylos said, his voice trembling slightly. For 20 years they have raided our hyperlanes. We formally requested United Earth military intervention 3 weeks ago. Theodore smiled, a gentle predatory curve of his lips. Ah, yes, the Orion separatists. I am pleased to inform you that military intervention will not be necessary. Xylos blinked. But they are massing a pirate fleet. They were massing a pirate fleet, Theodore corrected. However, yesterday morning, J.P. Morgan Stellar aggressively shorted the Orion separatists' primary currency on the Galactic Exchange, while simultaneously buying up all the orbital debt surrounding their pirate havens. By midnight, inflation within the separatist ranks hit 4,000%. Their warlords could no longer afford to pay their mercenaries. This morning the mercenaries mutinied, arrested the warlords, and handed them over to our corporate security teams in exchange for a debt forgiveness package. The entire assembly stared at Theodore. A decades-long border war, a conflict that had cost thousands of lives, had been resolved over a weekend without a single human ship firing a shot. The Orion separatists no longer exist, Theodore announced smoothly. Their territories have been rezoned as a free trade corridor managed by Amazon Exo Logistics. Theodore walked out from behind his podium, stepping to the very center of the assembly floor. He looked up at the tiered seating, locking eyes with the most powerful beings in the galaxy. When humanity first stepped onto the galactic stage, Theodore said, his voice lowering, echoing with absolute authority. You viewed us as prey. You saw a young, fragile species ripe for conquest. You measured strength in plasma batteries, dreadnoughts, and the willingness to burn cities to ash. He paused, letting the silence hang heavy in the air. But you fundamentally misunderstood the nature of power, Theodore whispered, though the microphones carried it to every ear in the room. War is inefficient.